Sony has just dropped a Super 35 version of the FX3. 6K oversampled video, 4K 120, 10-bit 422 in S-Log3, also has S-Cinetone, and you can load your own LUTs on it. Shoots 26 megapixel stills, has a dual base ISO, and body only costs $1,800. Obviously, this isn't the FX new or whatever it ends up being called. This is the FX3, but from what Sony said, in terms of design, it is identical on the outside. It's the guts, the internals that are different. So the whole purpose of this camera being made by Sony is to allow people to get into the cinema world at a much cheaper cost. The FX3 is the cheapest Sony cinema camera, the cheapest offering that they have, with the FX6 being the next most cheapest one, and this isn't really that cheap, nor is it easy to get hold of. So this is the cheapest one right now. The FX new will now take that spot. Now what is different? Well, it's a Super 35 6K oversampled sensor. Now that doesn't mean it gives you a 6K file. What it's doing is it's shooting on the 6K sensor, compressing it down into a 4K image, which is exactly the same as what the A7IV did. So they've taken the best bits of the FX3 and the technological advancements in the A7IV, so the 6K oversampled sensor, the autofocus improvements, and some other things that we'll talk about in a bit, and they've combined that into this new FX new. The sensor is a 3:2 aspect ratio. When it records in video, it becomes 16:9. But it also takes still images at 26 megapixels. It shoots 10-bit 422, 4K 120, 4K 60, HD 240 frames per second. So in terms of your recording formats, I've got it all written down here. So 4K Super 35, so it's a 6K oversampled image. It's a full pixel readout without pixel binding, 6K oversampling for high resolution 4K quality. Now, Super 35 16:9 oversampling from 6K is in 10-bit, 8-bit, long GOP, all-I, H.264 and H.265 up to 60 frames per second with a 1.04 times crop. Super 35 16:9 when shooting with 120 frames per second is a 1.6 times crop. Now it doesn't shoot in an MXF wrapper, which the FX6 does. It's an MP4, much like the FX3 is. You can of course record in S-Log3. You also have S-Cinetone, and you can also, like in the new FX3 update, firmware update, you can now have your own LUTs and view them on the camera, but also bake them into a file, so you basically don't have to grade. So if you use the Phantom LUTs like I do for everything, you can get a 15% discount down below. If you haven't used those before, they're amazing. You can literally just put those onto the camera, record an S-Log3, have it output to that LUT, and you're set. You don't need to grade at all. You got dual base ISOs 800 and 2500, so shooting in low light. Very unusual to have in a camera like this, and Sony said it's technically an advancement for them. It's not something that they've done before. You also have the same FX3 settings that you have in terms of Cine EI, flexible ISO, Cine EI quick. If you're not too sure what Cine EI is, I will link a video up here to my buddy Josh's video who explains it very well. But in short, very simply put, it is basically making sure that you're always recording in the best possible image quality that you can, maximizing your dynamic range, which is going to be when you're shooting at one of the two base ISOs at 800 or 2500. You can't shoot anything outside of that. You have to light or get faster glass to compensate for that. If you don't like the sound of that, you can still shoot in the flexible ISO options where you just change it as and when you want to, and then you just basically pick the ISO you want to use. You can go past the 2500, just know that when you do, you're gonna start to introduce grain and your image quality is going to deteriorate. You have the same autofocus that Sony has in the A7IV, literally the latest and greatest that they have to offer. And you can use that in 4K 120, so all the way up to the maximum frame rate that Sony offers. That is of course with IAF, so tracking the eye and animal autofocus as well. You also have autofocus assist, which allows you to be in autofocus, but if you need to quickly override it for whatever reason, you can just turn the autofocus ring and it will allow you to manually focus. On top of that, you do have the focus map in terms of when you're shooting in stills, which is introduced in the A7IV, and you also have breathing compensation, which is huge, which basically eliminates any form of focus breathing if you're using specific Sony glass. You do have the same active stabilization that you have in all of Sony's other cameras, so the A7S III, the FX3, the A7IV, you have that same stabilization. And the metadata is recorded to the FX new as well, which allows you to then put that file into Catalyst Browse, and there is a new version of Catalyst Browse actually coming, apparently the same time that this camera will be launching in October. Catalyst Browse will allow you to stabilize footage that really wasn't stable when you shot it. You can also embed the LUT directly into the file that you record. You can also play around with the image rotation. You've got breathing compensations that you can change around inside there after you've shot it, and a whole bunch of other things as well that Sony has said is coming. On top of that, it does have the same fan that is inside the FX3, same design, so you can shoot non-stop in really hot environments without having to worry about it potentially overheating and then shutting down. Uses the same batteries that the FX3 does, obviously, as it's the same design. It can be powered over USB via power delivery, so USB-C. So it really is a perfect camera for if you need to shoot long extended periods of video, much like it should be because it is a cinema camera. Sony has taken the newer design from the FX3's updated firmware as well, and they've put that into the FX-NEW, so it's more like what you get in the FX6. It's not identical, but it's very similar. It's a little bit easier, a little bit quicker to reference things and change things around just when you're on the fly instead of having to go deep into the menus. Something else that Sony has done, which they did with the update in the FX3, the new firmware, is they basically rearranged the way the screen looks. So when you're recording video, you don't have any of the icons kind of covering like tiny portion of your video as you're recording it live like it does on the A7S III. So now it's all set up nicely around what you're actually recording. So you just have like an actual view of what it is you're recording without being impeded by a couple of little icons here and there. So that's really nice. I'm glad that they did that. It's a much nicer experience to shoot with that compared to the A7S III, which I'm shooting on right now. And things are just covering little parts of the screen, and it's kind of frustrating sometimes. I mean, it was fine. Never had an issue with it until I tried what this now has and the FX-NEW has, and it's better. In terms of a body design, I mean, if we just do that, that's basically it. Apparently it's exactly the same, has all the same threaded holes on the outside there, so you don't necessarily need to use the cage if you don't want to, and you can mount things to it. It does come supplied with the same audio handle, which screws onto the top here, goes into the hot shoe. I'm actually using mine right now, so I can't show it to you. It does come with that, the same one that comes with the FX3. Now there is a version that's with that and a body-only version as well. You got all the same ports that you have on the FX3, full-size HDMI, none of that micro stuff that Canon has. You can jam in timecode into the FX-NEW as well, much like you can with the FX3 now, since the firmware update, and you can obviously do on the FX6 as well. So that is a true cinema feature, which you do have on the FX-NEW. You got all the tally lights on there. Tally lights are, oh, it's not gonna let me record because there's no memory card in there. Tally lights are the little red lights that appear when you're recording. They're super handy. That button on the front there is super handy, having a record button there if you film yourself for whatever reason. Big red button on the top there, that lights up red. You've got the zoom rocker on there as well if you're using a power zoom lens. Remember those APS-C lenses that Sony brought out a few months back? Those actually now will pair very well with this. The zoom rocker on there, that's gonna be perfect for that 10 to 20 f4 power zoom, the new one. That's basically the equivalent of the 1635 f4 power zoom full frame version, which you'd use with the FX3. Now you can use that zoom rocker there to zoom in and out without actually having to turn the lens manually yourself. The 11 f1.8 and the 15 f1.4, they will pair very well with the FX-NEW as well. There is no variable ND. That was a question that actually came up on the call that we had. There isn't enough space inside the FX3's body to have that variable ND in there. So no variable ND in there like the FX6 has. I mean, that's the body you're working with really for an FX6. There's a lot of space in there for a variable ND, but to give you an idea of how much space you need in there, there's not enough room inside that bigger body there for a variable ND and stabilization, the active stabilization that's in the FX3. So you can have one or the other. So I mean, when you look at that, really, it does become pretty obvious that there's definitely not enough room inside the FX3 or the FX-NEW for a variable ND. If you want the version with the handle, it will come in at $21.99 US, $28.99 Canadian. If you want the version without the handle, the body-only version, which is what I will probably end up picking up, that comes in at $17.99. Incredibly aggressive pricing from Sony for a camera that really does pack a punch. And this is going to pair very well with anybody that has maybe an FX6, an FX3, even an A7S III, and you want to have a B or a C camera, like the cheapest B or C camera you could possibly get instead of having to buy another FX3. This is going to be that. Or if you wanted an FX3 and you're very happy with APS-C Super 35, and you can get it for a lot less money, coming in at $18.99 body only. That's all I got for you today. I will post my FX3 review for you up here if you're interested in that. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. Take care.